So there are two arguments I heard Andreas Antonopoulos make, which I couldn't disagree more. Andreas, we all love for describing the current financial system so well. So I think it'll be worth the time to consider. So the first argument Andreas makes is regarding Bitcoin first mover advantage, and according to him, the promise of future use and dominance. And the second argument he makes, which I disagree with, is the supremacy of proof of work. So, for the first argument regarding first movers, I think there's a lot to be said about being a first mover. Uh, the example that comes into my mind is the Ethernet cable, which, if you plug out of your wall, you would notice it has 8 wires. And each wire can take either one of two states, either a 0 or a 1. Either it has electricity running through it or it does not. So you have two options, and you have 8 wires. That would make it 2 to the power of 8 or 256. And if you look at your keyboard, you would generally notice it does not have more than 256 buttons for that reason. So each letter and each number could be represented by an ASCII code, which can in turn be representative by 8 bits of information, or 8 wires, or 1 byte of information. Now, such wires are running through billions of houses and businesses. And if you are a new business and you wish to innovate in the field of internet and communication, well, you'll be far better off using the current infrastructure. You would need to bring, in fact, you would need to bring a far superior technology, let's say fiber optics, in order for people to consider making the investments for that new infrastructure. And still, most people would most probably rather use the current infrastructure simply because it would be far, far cheaper. Another example I liked, I read in an article by an organization called Landmark Education, where they make the point that the transportation infrastructure we have today was initially constructed to fit 2 horses and a carriage. Later on, it was for cars, which used that same infrastructure. And today, we have rockets that fly into space. The components that compose these rockets had to be transported using that old infrastructure. And by doing so, they introduced into these components those limitations, again, having to be transported through that system. So the point you was making is that the most modern technology today, rockets flying into space, holds in it limitations that were introduced thousands of years ago. So again, the current modern technologies have limitations that were introduced thousands of years ago. So most certainly, being the first mover or being the first, most certainly is a strong argument as for future use and implication. However, and this is where the argument fails, the most optimistic estimates say that anywhere between 30 million to 50 million people use cryptos. So that would be less than 1% of the entire world population. And for that simple reason, this argument does not hold. So if I have some transportation system in my own backyard, it is ridiculous to think that future technologies would be limited by the roads that I constructed in my backyard. So it is the fact that million people use this infrastructure that makes the argument about its dominance or future use and dominance. So again, I think that the idea that Bitcoin is here to stay simply because it was here first and not giving any weight to the fact that there is such a small use currently is false. The second argument about the supremacy of proof of work. Again, I think that this concept of proof of work currently is a bug and not a feature. I think that Bitcoin, this concept of using a software to exchange value between people, is an amazing concept. And the fact that we were able to create a digital asset that cannot be duplicated is amazing. It is simply amazing. I was amazed when I encountered the software. Before I was introduced to Bitcoin, every time I thought about fiat or paper currency, I went back to real assets, whether gold or land or anything that cannot be diluted by someone else. This idea of constructing something digital which cannot be duplicated simply did not occur to me. But now that it has, I am certain that we can think of other ways of achieving consensus, ways which are not as wasteful. So, again, and here I would make the argument, specifically, I would make the argument that proof of stake is the ultimate proof of work. I think that people confuse, and let's take Ethereum for example, and let's imagine we are now at the end of 2019. So let's imagine that somewhere in the next 2 years they will be able to achieve um, proof of stake. I think that people confuse Ethereum for fiat. Namely, how would a person acquire Ethereum? And the answer is by doing something for someone, that is to say, doing work that free people consider as valuable in order to attain Ethereum. As for staking itself, in this case, again, what you stake is something you have earned. That is to say, you've done work for someone else. And by not consuming it today uh, and validating transactions, you create value. So again, the interest you earn is exactly that. It's interest you earn. And therefore, I think that proof of stake is the ultimate proof of work. And the idea that some murderer or a pedophile has access to electricity is something superior. It's not. Again, if that is the only option we had between government's fiat and using electricity, I would go for the electricity. However, I am certain that in time we would find better ways of reaching consensus. And if that is the case, I think that Bitcoin, which is very low in adoption currently, in time would slowly become irrelevant. It would be the software that no one can upgrade, that uses a lot of electricity to achieve consensus, where others can do the same for far, far cheaper. And again, far better, because when you do work to earn Ethereum, you do actual work according to free people rather than consume electricity.